Last time on Dragon Ball Z.
Well, that was interesting. Let's try something different for this video. First, introductions. My name is AthieshGaming, and I am a tank main in Classic WoW. I actually got my start playing very casually through Vanilla and TBC, and later on became a Protection and Retribution Paladin Raider in Wrath of the Lich King, quitting with TGT because it's awful.
Boo! You suck!
In the meantime, however, I made some really good friends, and they instilled in me the mantra of get good. And with this newfound get goodness, I embarked on my Classic WoW journey. Since then, I've been the off-tank / substitute main tank for my guild, tanked every single boss in Classic WoW, have a 96 average parse in Nex and a 97 in AQ during Phase 5. My guild overall was top 20 Horde US for Nex Rammus progression and top 10 Horde US for AQ progression. So does this mean that you're an elite tank, come on down from on high to deliver your godly wisdom? And the answer to that is hell no. There are people who are much better at tanking than me and who have been playing this game for the entire time that I took my break and have years more experience. I'm about 2 years into really being a dedicated raider. There are people with 12 years, 15 years. So as far as the best of the best, that's not me. However, I've always been really interested in theory and mechanics and fundamentals and how all those come together into execution. So as far as my knowledge base, it's mostly tanking and followed by DPS, and then I'm very interested in how that actually functions and interacts in games, all the stats and such. So I figured I'd make this video to share what I know, increase my own knowledge, and hopefully you learn something as well. So with that said, let's get into the video.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Before we get into mechanics, I'd like to go over some definitions. The first being the difference between optimal and viable. So I often mention that a tank will be the best or bad at something, but really what I mean is they're either optimal or viable. And the optimal choice is the one best suited to a particular task or role. They will either perform that task or role better or have a much easier time doing it, whereas a viable choice is one that can perform a task role adequately, but they might require more support or effort in order to accomplish the same task as the optimal choice. So they could bring more of a challenge in actually completing the task. To illustrate this, let's say your goal is to get from point A to point B driving as fast as possible. Well, obviously you'll take this, a Formula 1 car. It's the fastest thing on 4 wheels that people can actually drive. But you could also take a pickup truck and get from point A to point B on a road. It might not be as quick, but you could still get there. But what if point A and point B are now separated by a gravel road with a mountain climb in between? Well, then maybe your optimal choice looks something more like this. But you could take that same pickup, maybe you have to throw on some extra chains, but you could drive it over that, whereas the race car would be completely non-viable for the snowy dirt road mountain climb. So let's bring this analogy back around to TBC tanking. And what I want to say is that there is no example as extreme as the race car going up a mountain. Every tank can do the fights, however, it may require more effort on your part as a player in gearing, talenting, ability usage, or more effort on part of your raid and how they are set up in order for you to viably tank a fight as compared to, say, the optimal choice. But don't be dissuaded if you hear me say that a tank is the best or the worst at something. Generally speaking, the worst will be at least able to do it, and the best will generally, as stated, be the most optimal. They'll have the easiest time or will get the most effect out of their actions on that particular kind of fight. So That's all I have to say about optimal viable differences. Let's move on to the next item.
What makes a good tank?
So now that we've covered the disclaimers, let's talk about what makes a good tank. What metrics should we judge tanks by? And I think there are two primary metrics and two secondary metrics by which we can judge tanks. The two primary metrics are not dying and making sure you get hit by the boss. Those are the two things that you expect from your tank. The two secondary factors are your utility, all of the additional value you add by being a raid member. These can be unique buffs, unique debuffs, interrupts, CCs, anything that is making the raid easier for everyone. And lastly, role flexibility. How useful are you, the tank, when you're not tanking? Can you do something else? Are you worth the raid spot when you're not tanking? So let's get into each of these, starting with not dying.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
So how exactly do you not die when being hit by a boss which deals tons of damage? Well, the answer to that is mitigation, which comes in two primary aspects. That being avoidance, which is when you completely avoid damage being dealt by the boss. This is parry, dodge, and boss miss, all of which can be increased by your stats, talents, and usable abilities by raid members. The other form is damage reduction. And damage reduction is when you actually reduce the damage you are dealt after it connects. So it hasn't been missed, it hasn't been parried or dodged. This is hitting you. Most bosses will deal more damage than you have HP, so you need to reduce that damage. And the primary forms of damage reduction are armor, which is a percent reduction of physical damage with a cap of 75%. Talents and skills, which are a percent reduction after armor. And then finally, blocking, which is a flat reduction to physical damage applied last after armor and talents. Two terms you'll see thrown around quite often is Uncrittable and Uncrushable, and you'll be told how important these are for tanks. And I'm going to explain these, but first we need to take a look at the boss attack table. And here it is, the boss attack table when targeting players. So every time a boss goes to make an attack, there is a 100-sided dice that is rolled, and the result is what happens. As you can see from this table, there is a 5.6% chance to be crit, which means that you will take double damage, and a 15% chance to be crushed or to receive a crushing blow, which is 1.5 times damage. Becoming uncrittable and uncrushable means reducing these chances to 0. How do you do this? Well, for crit, it is quite simple. There are two stats, defense and resilience, and they directly reduce the amount of crits that you take. Pretty simple. But for crushing blows, what you need to do is, as the green sections get filled up, as you get more parry, dodge, and block, they will take increasingly larger chunks of the potential roll of the dice. Now, if you can have your combined miss, dodge, parry, and block equal over 102.4% chance, what that means is the boss can no longer roll a crushing blow. You have pushed them off the attack table. That is what it means to be uncrushable, and it means that you will never receive another crushing blow once you have that level of avoidance. So, as stated, there are certain breakpoints to become uncrittable by the bosses. Just to reiterate, critical strikes when bosses deal double damage with their attacks, and this will cause you to be one-shot. It is reduced by defense rating, resilience, and talents. Resilience is usually less expensive as a stat on gear, meaning you will get more of it than defense on the same item level of gear. However, defense also grants avoidance, with each point increasing your ability to block, dodge, and parry. These two stats can be mixed together in order to achieve uncrittability. The conversion rates are 2.36 defense rating per 1 defense skill, and 39.4 resilience rating per 1 resilience. For warriors and paladins, they will need 490 defense skill, or 330 defense rating to be Uncrittable, or 5.6 resilience, which is the equivalent of 221 resilience rating. Druids, however, have a talent which reduces their chance to be crit by 3%. Because of this, they will only require 415 defense skill, or 153 defense rating, or 2.6 resilience, which is the equivalent of 102 resilience rating. To note, warriors and paladins will both get 20 defense skill, which is the equivalent of 47.2 defense rating from talents. So when you are looking at these conversions and building out your gear, just make a note of that. So Uncrushable is actually a little bit harder to get than Uncrittable, but very worthwhile to get. The avoidance cap that you need to hit is 102.4% to push crushing blows off of the attack table. The reason why this is so important is because tanks usually don't die from just regular sustained damage, but from damage spikes. And if you can just randomly take 1.5 times damage, you will find that you die a lot more than tanks that don't randomly take 1.5 times normal damage. And last, but certainly not least, we have defensive cooldowns. These are items and abilities you can use as the tank to prevent yourself from dying. Your primary use cases are either going to be reacting to damage spikes or mitigating higher boss damage, like from a mechanic, or if your healer is somehow been disabled through crowd control, being or dying. This can be the difference between downing a boss or dying with the boss at 3%. So these are things to keep in mind, though they are generally reactive abilities and not something that you necessarily will have to use on a given fight. I want to make a special note for health stones being very important. Warlocks do get the ability to give out lots of health stones, so there's no excuse for not having one prior to a boss fight. Otherwise, all of the defensive cooldowns are going to be class abilities, and we will discuss those in more detail during the class-specific breakdowns. So that concludes our discussion of how to prevent yourself from dying as a tank. Now let's move on to the next most important thing, which is how to make sure that the boss is hitting you and not your fellow raid members.
See, what I can't understand is why you gotta come down here bringing all this ruckus, snatching up galaxies and everything. My attitude is, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. Need to ease up out my face for something bad happened to you. Too late.
And with that excellent demonstration by Agent J on how to hold the boss's threat while the DPS kills it, we move into our next section. So threat. Threat is the means by which you keep the boss's attention focused on hitting you, and more importantly, it is the ceiling for your DPS and boss kill times. If the threat isn't there, then necessarily your DPS will have to slow down, which means that the boss will die slower. The slower a boss dies, the more mechanics you have to deal, the more phases you have to go through if it's a repetitive boss. So, threat is a very important part of tanking. There are, however, different kinds of threat, and the simplest type is the single target threat. Most boss fights are single target, so this is the kind of threat that will come into play most often in your encounters, and is generally what people are talking about when they mention threat generation. It is, however, not the only threat, and we'll be getting into that next. AoE threat is the ability to hold multiple mobs at the same time, and it is really crucial for TBC as many trash packs will have more mobs than there are tanks. In addition, there are several bosses which will spawn adds or have adds as part of their mechanics, in which case you will want to have a tank assigned to tank multiple of them. Overall, this is very effective for speeding up your trash clears and can simplify several boss mechanics. The other thing to keep in mind with AoE threat is that there's both the amount of threat you can generate and then the number of targets. Some tanks may cap out at 2 or 4 or an arbitrary number, and that is an important thing to consider when ranking AoE threat. Snap threat or burst threat is how much threat you can generate in a very small window. This is both a timer on how quickly DPS can open up on a priority target, or your ability to safely grab adds mid-fight. If you have high burst threat, that means that players can do more damage quicker, and especially on squishier targets that have to die fast, it is really shortening that window in which the mob can be safely killed. Additionally, it's also how quickly you can pull a mob off of a healer or a DPS that has inadvertently pulled aggro. If you can burst some aggro really quickly, you can grab it back. So that's something to consider when talking about threat. It's not just single target in AoE, but how quickly and in how short a window can you generate a good lump of threat to give your DPS a safety net. So that will cover threat, and we'll go more in depth when I get to each individual class video. But for now, let's jump into utility and flexibility.
Check it out. Compass, matches, whistle, saw, panic button, squirrel snare, radon/lie detector, sphygmomanometer, and it's even got turn signals.
So utility, or everything else you bring to a raid as a tank. This can range from buffs that increase your raid's damage, to debuffs that decrease the boss's damage, to even powerful cooldowns like invulnerability or combat reses. Using these effectively will not necessarily make or break your ability to do the primary thing of taking damage and holding threat, but leveraging your utility can make your raid experience way different and is a great separator of really good from great tanks. The other thing to mention is that being able to flex into another role, and in this case I'm just going to say it is druids, though they have a decently high skill floor, can be DPS, and paladins can kind of off heal with enough gear. So in any fight where only one tank is needed, you are way more useful if you can provide something else that the raid requires. And that's really what these third and fourth metrics cover, is all of that stuff you can do that isn't directly tanking, but ties into it and is an asset to your raid. So with utility out of the way, I want to talk about phases. I'm sure you're aware of content phases. So we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase 5. They have different raid tiers associated, which you can see on the screen. But I want to talk about the phases within content as well. So we have progression, optimization, and farming. Progression is when you're first trying to down bosses and you're wearing entirely previous tier gear. Optimization is where you're wearing a mix of previous and current tier gear and are trying to get consistent on your boss kills. And then last we have farming, where you're wearing mostly current tier gear and you are already consistent and you're trying to become as efficient and minimize and zero out actually all errors so that you can have clean raids. The reason I bring this up is because the strength of tanks will vary with both of these. So within the content phases, certain tanks will be stronger or weaker relative to the other tanks. And within the progression, optimization, and farming, certain tanks will vary in their ability to perform optimally. And I will cover these when I go over the tanks, but I wanted to at least introduce this idea of there being both the content phases and the phases within the content. And that will wrap up the video. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I had a lot of fun learning my editing software and trying to make this a bit more of an entertaining experience. In future videos, I'm going to cover each class individually, so the warrior, the paladin, and the druid. I'll be running through and using all of the metrics that I discussed here previously, and after I've gone through each class individually, I will release a video in which I compare all 3 of them, talk about their relative strengths, what they are optimal for, and what they have a harder time doing, and then we can come to some conclusions. Anyways, I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you later.